You almost there?
But I just did it. Like I thought I just did was setting it up. Let's do it again. Okay, I'm thinking we're live.
Okay. Well,
Yep.
The unknown beer can collector just decided to come in. So I appreciate everybody taking the time with the holidays coming up and everything. We wanted to take an opportunity to tap into one of the real great Pabst Brewery known collectors and historians, Miss Kip Rodier. He is actually sitting in the 33 room, and I'm going to turn it over to Kip real quick before we start the brief. And Kip, tell us a little bit about yourself, how far away you live from the Pabst Brewery, and all those other things you like to share with us.
All right, thanks, Keith. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. Greetings from the congenial 33 room, which is the hospitality room at the former brewery the Pabst Brewing Company had here in Peoria Heights, Illinois. We will get into a lot more detail about that as the presentation goes on. A little bit about myself. I was born 3.5 miles from the Pabst Brewery. The wind must be blowing out of the northeast that day to get, the beer in my blood, the collecting. I officially got started into collecting in about 1976, 1977. I was about 10 years old. My older brother and his best friend, Tim Kirshner, who's basically another brother to the family. They were into collecting cans. They were out digging and dumping for cans. And as a little kid looking up to them too, I got the beer can collecting bug in my blood, and I haven't been able to get rid of it since. So as I got older and learned more about, the breweries, I found out that Pabst had a brewery here in Peoria Heights. I was aware of it growing up. If you ever had to drive through downtown Peoria Heights, you couldn't miss the smell. The semi trucks would block half the lanes of traffic. So it was a well-known presence. But as I got into cans, then I really got more intrigued about the brewery here and tried to learn, why did Pabst open a brewery just 220 miles south of Milwaukee, their main headquarters that supplied beer internationally before Prohibition. So tonight, hopefully we're going to tell that story and you'll learn a lot more about Pabst and Peoria.
All right, Kip, appreciate it. I'm going to start with your slides there. And like I said, you just tell me when you want me to go on to the next slide, and that's what we'll do.
Okay, sounds good. If you want to go ahead to the next slide.
All right.
So to start off, Pabst in Milwaukee, their first actual presence in Peoria was in 1881 when Best Brewing Company opened a branch here in town. Branches then were distributors. They were bottlers, depending on how close they were to the brewery. The farther away you were from the brewery, the more expense you had shipping empty bottles back to the brewery to be filled. So it was just a lot easier for the brewery to ship kegs to the branches. They could bottle it on site and distribute it around town. And another big feature of the branches were they were also, real estate agents. Breweries bought a lot of properties for tied houses, and the distributors acted as the real estate agents for the brewery, buying up bars and leasing the bars so they could have their beer in that tavern. There's no known Pabst tied houses in Peoria. Obviously, there was quite a few at one time. The only known tied house around here is up in Kewanee, Illinois. It's called Cerno's Bar and Grill. It starts with a C. If you're ever in the area, it's worth a visit. The bar was built in the late 1800s in Belgium by Pabst. It was handmade. It's a 50-foot mahogany mirrored bar with hand-carved sculptures on it. If you're a Pabst collector, it's worth a trip to Cerno's. Okay, next slide. So on this slide, you'll see an example of the bottle label that the Peoria branch bottled here in town for Milwaukee. And the letters you see in the background, those are from the late 1800s. Basically, every one of them was talking about real estate transactions like, hey, we're going to buy this or we're going to sell this. So it's amazing how much land and real estate breweries owned back before Prohibition and after Prohibition for tied houses. Okay, you can go ahead to the next slide.
Yeah, so this was a slide I added to Kip's brief. I had found it for him, and it came from a kind of a souvenir postcard booklet, and it's dated May 1892. And like Kip was saying, I mean, the Peoria branch was not very far away from the original branch up in Milwaukee, the original brewery up in Milwaukee. But what I thought was kind of interesting was this actually shows all the different branch offices. There was a Chicago main branch, the Peoria branch, which is listed on there. Kansas City had a branch, St. Paul had a branch, Pittsburgh had a branch, Washington had a branch, New York had a branch, Galveston had a branch, Minneapolis, Harlem, Boston, Dallas, Denison, and Houston. So then it also says there were branches in Buffalo, New York, Louisville, Kentucky, and then up in Wausau, Wisconsin, and Streator, Illinois. So those are the types of branches like Kip was talking about, and Peoria happened to be one of those branches. And so on this slide, just to kind of give everybody some perspective how close it is, I mean, it's just down the road from Milwaukee. Granted, back in those days, there was no such thing as interstates. So still, to push the beer down, it was still fairly close if they were going to push it down to Peoria, because they didn't have the brewery functioning down in Peoria at the time, but they were doing all the bottling down there. So this kind of gives you some perspective of how close it was. All right, there you go, Kip.
That's good. Okay, so to really start the story of how Pabst ended up in Peoria Heights in the Peoria area, we have to go about 85 miles southeast of Peoria Heights to a little town called Decatur, Illinois. Decatur Brewing Company was down there, small brewery company doing good. They captured all the sales in the local market. They were pretty much selling everything they were making. In 1912, local option for prohibition hit Decatur. When that hit, that wiped out the majority of Decatur Brewing Company's market, limiting them down to 30,000 barrels is what they were brewing. It's interesting that even though they chose local option for prohibition, they could still brew for markets that weren't in prohibition yet. So to help offset some of this loss of their sales, Decatur Brewing Company actually went to Pabst and became a distributing agent of Pabst. Basically, they became a distributor for Pabst because Pabst was easier to sell in the farther markets where the smaller brewers back then incurred a lot of expense shipping their product. But selling Pabst was an easy sell, and they could get more money for Pabst beer than they could theirs. So they went in with this venture with Pabst distributing their beer. It was so profitable selling Pabst that by 1916, Decatur Brewing Company quit brewing beer altogether and just was distributing Pabst. But now you got World War I going on. You have sugar shortages because of the war. The USDA recommended malt syrup as a substitute for cane sugar. So this was very intriguing to Decatur Brewing Company. They wanted to get in the malt syrup market to help increase sales. They got a brewery on their hands. Why not? Brewing beer and malt syrup is very close in step. So why not get in the malt syrup market? So they reached out to some chemical engineering consultants, the Singer Pearlstein Company in 1918 for help getting in the malt syrup market. So apparently the malt syrup that they started developing with the Singer Pearlstein Company, was a hit and started selling it. Sales started going through the roof. They maxed out malt syrup production at the brewery in Decatur. They bought a shuttered brewery in Steubenville, Ohio, and they started making malt syrup in that brewery. And, sales kept going. Well, now they're out of capacity at that brewery too. So they decided we need to find a place that we can grow. So they came up to Peoria Heights. They found an old automobile factory that they bought, and they started construction of a malt house down on the river. So at the same time, this is 1924. Later in 1918, they actually started using the trade name Premier Malt Products, even though they were Decatur Brewing Company. So in 1924, they decided to make the move to Peoria Heights. They shut down the Steubenville, Ohio brewery because it was just too small. And at the same time, the offices officially moved to Peoria Heights. They merged the Decatur Brewing Company with the Singer Pearlstein Company. And moving to Peoria Heights, they put Philip Singer, president, and Harris Pearlstein as treasurer, which some of you Pabst people have probably heard Harris Pearlstein's name, and it'll come up again later. Okay, go ahead to the. So Decatur was plant number 1. Plant number 2 was the malt house down by the river. The picture on the left was from when it was Premier Pabst, but the one neat thing about that photo is that if you can see it on your screen, the 2 huge Pabst neons that they had. So every motorist going over the Cedar Street Bridge saw the Pabst neons. The image on the right was a postcard that Peoria had put out touting the new Cedar Street Bridge. It's just a little luck that Pabst Malt House was in the background. Unfortunately, all of these buildings are gone. The Cedar Street Bridge is still there. Just to the left of the black and white picture is where Hiram Walker is. So if you're familiar with Hiram Walker in Peoria. Okay, next photo, please, or next slide. So the automobile plant they bought in Peoria Heights used to manufacture the Glide automobiles from the Bartholomew Company. People local to Peoria, President Teddy Roosevelt came to Peoria in 1910. They gave him a tour around town of Peoria and Peoria Heights in a Glide automobile. Up here on Grandview Drive, which is just right up the street from where I'm at here at the brewery, they took him on a drive on Grandview Drive, and he dubbed this the world's most beautiful drive. So Peoria took that, making an acronym, WMBD, and we have a TV station and a radio station that still use that WMBD. So, okay, so we'll get back to the brewery. Next slide, please. So after about a year of building improvements and additions, this was the brand new malt syrup plant in Peoria Heights, Illinois for Premier Malt Products. It was their headquarters, the main plant. If you can see in the middle of the image, there's the train. The loading docks were just on the other side of that from the original factory, but everything on this side of the train was added on by Premier Malt Products. The power station, there was a recreation house, tennis courts. If you look down at the lower right of the image, tennis courts were added. Okay, so sales continued to grow for Premier Malt Products and their Blue Ribbon malt syrup. It was America's leading selling malt syrup, actually. So now they need to expand again for more malt syrup production. Next slide, please. So in 1927, they bought the old Lysy Brewery, which was actually in operation making malt syrup by the Bosch Food Products Company. So Premier Malt Products bought them out. That became plant number 4, the syrup plant. And later on, they added a grist mill to it. So a lot of locals here, if you hear somebody refer to the grist mill in Peoria, they're referring to the old Lysy plant. Okay, next slide, please. So this is later in 1927, Premier Malt Products put out recipe books with countless recipes for their malt syrup, because that's how it was pushed. It was advertised for baking, even though it was probably had more use as home brewing. But here's a shot showing all 4 plants. Decatur's in the upper left. The upper right is the malt house along the river. Obviously the Peoria Heights main complex in the center. And if you look, tennis courts are still there. And then in the lower right is the former Lysy plant. Okay, next slide, please. So some of what Premier Malt made here in Peoria Heights and Peoria, malt syrup. Some bakers did use it, home brewers used it a lot. Tobacco manufacturers, pharmaceutical syrups, maltose was made. The image of the boy putting a worm on a hook and the dog, Premier Malt had hired an author or an artist, commissioned him to do 2 paintings. This was 1932 and 1933. They actually issued those lithographs. And Lena is the lady's name, the mascot for Premier Malt. So Premier Malt Products, can't sell enough malt extract. They have America's leading seller malt syrup. Now they're looking at national prohibition coming. So with national prohibition ending. Next slide, please. So now Premier, with prohibition ending, You know, Pabst in Milwaukee is ready to start making beer again, but Prohibition wasn't as kind to them. You know, they didn't make the money they did before Prohibition. They'd actually leased some of the buildings in Milwaukee just for income to try to make ends meet and get through Prohibition. Premier Malt, on the other hand, had more money than they knew what to do with, but they didn't have a nationally recognized beer to jump into the beer making market after Prohibition. So as luck would have it, Harris Perlstein, who is now president of Premier Malt Products, him and Fred Pabst, who's the president of Pabst, they both were on the National Malt Products Manufacturers Association board and had worked with each other for years on the board. So they had an idea of how each other ran their business. Well, one of them threw out the idea like, hey, why don't we merge? I got the money, you got the beer. Let's, you know, it's a match made in heaven. So October 28th, 1932, they agreed to merge the companies and Premier Pabst Corporation was born. The next slide, please. So with Prohibition ending, they need to make a brewery here in Peoria Heights. So in 1933, construction began actually on July 15th, ground was broken. Construction went out through the year. You know, the far right, the stock house and the rack house photos, tanks being put in. Next slide, please. So the grand opening of the brewery was in 1934. It was actually delayed because on January 29th of 34, a fire started on the 5th floor of the stock house. The fire actually melted the tank. The tanks you see there, the fire melted the linings out of all the tanks. Girders and beams were warped from the fire. The main tower was actually 9 inches out of plumb due to the twisted metal. I actually came across, there's a construction diary that somebody from the brewery had kept track of day by day building activities when it was built. So the entry on the day of the fire, I'll read what they entered. The afternoon the fire started, there was a stiff wind blowing from the northwest. It was 8 degrees below zero. And the water supply for the fire pump was actually the cistern under the recreation building, which by the way was empty as the floor was being repaired. The water pressure from the village of Peoria Heights was insufficient enough for this height. Downtown Peoria Heights had maybe 4 or 5 2-story buildings. So to have a 6-story building, they couldn't get the water up there to get the fire out. So throughout the night and into the next morning, they finally got the fire out. So it obviously had to be rebuilt. The upper floors had to be rebuilt, which delayed the opening of the actual brewery itself. Next slide, please. So later in 1934, Premier Pabst has their brand new Peoria Heights brewery completed and ready to brew ale and beer for the corporation in Milwaukee. You can still see the original factory buildings on the right side, and then everything in this new brewery construction, the loading docks and the bottle house is the building on the left. Just a little side note for another story later on. Any Rusty Bunch guys here who read the story about the Pabst dump a couple years ago, there's a Pabst dump that we found behind the brewery. If you look at the railroad tracks up on top, the one that kind of goes up in the upper right, you go up there about 50 yards and there's a ravine off to the right. They pulled the train car right there and all the cans got chucked right there. I've got one I can show later, but if anybody wants to go dig some Pabst cans, there's still probably 3,000 or 4,000 of them there. Okay, next slide, please. So production begins in 1934. One of the main benefits of Pabst having the brewery here in Peoria Heights was to help brew ale. Pabst sold a bunch of ale before Prohibition, and having this extra capacity here for the ale brewing was huge for Pabst. They obviously made Blue Ribbon beer as well. So those were the first 2 brands out of the brewery. The Casino bottle that you see pictured here, that's courtesy of John Steiner from his collection. The Chicago, the World's Exposition in Chicago in 1933, Pabst actually built a casino up there and Milwaukee brewed casino beer for sale at their casino. Well, apparently the beer was well received from the public that in November of 34, they actually started brewing it down here in Peoria. And it's interesting, if you can read the label, they used the Premier Puritan Company was the brand that they used, because during Prohibition, I believe Pabst and bought out Puritan Company, which was making malt syrup. 1935, beer in cans was introduced for the very first time. And before, Pabst actually test marketed their cans here in Peoria and in Rockford. But before they even test marketed their cans, Harris Perlstein, he is now president of Pabst. He was the chemist that Decatur hired. He's now worked his way up to president of Pabst. So when beer in cans was to be introduced, he's like, okay, we're not going to release Pabst in cans until I can do a blind taste test and tell a beer from a bottle and a can. And when I can not tell the difference, then we're going to put it on the market. The first time they put a can and a bottle blind test in front of him, he tastes it. That's the bottle, that's the can. Get back to the drawing board. They did this 2-3 times before he was finally satisfied with the content in the cans. Like, okay, let's go to market. And in June of 35, Pabst test marketed their Pabst Export beer. And they chose Export instead of Blue Ribbon because they still weren't sure how this beer in cans was going to go over, and they didn't want to risk the reputation of the Blue Ribbon label. They had sold Export beer before Prohibition, so they decided just to put Export on it. And that Export was used up until 1938 when they finally, were confident to put the Blue Ribbon back on the cans. And it was August 11th of 1935 that the first Kappa can was introduced. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and this is an article I cut out because we had talked about the casino beer.
Yep.
And I asked Kip if I could put this in here, but it just basically shows kind of just historically where the casino beer name and brand label had come from. And this was the place set up to initially start selling the casino beer. So I thought to include that. It's not Peoria specific, but it does give you some historical background on where the name casino beer had come from.
Exactly. It was just appeared to be a one-off beer they made for that, but it must have been a good one.
Yeah, and this was another ad I cut out. Kip had not seen it before, but I just wanted to point out that it says the largest, most scientific ale brewery in the United States. And it says, to give America its own fine ale, we built our plant, the largest ale brewery in the United States, embodying the most recent scientific developments of the brewing art, splendidly located in Peoria, Illinois, at one of the highest points in the state, where the air is pure and the water pumped from the deep, cool wells is just right. So this was some of the first ads that had come out supporting Peoria and the ale brewery.
Yeah, those ads are neat. I'd never seen those before, and that was from a New York paper, I think, Keith.
I can't remember where I pulled that one from. No, that was actually a Chicago newspaper from 1934.
Okay. Yeah, it's neat because they actually show an image of the brewery in the background. Okay, so this slide is some kind of random shots. The upper left, you'll see it's a picture from 1934 of the finished brewery. I wish I'd kind of put this one on its own slide. What I'm trying to show is right in front of the brewery, that's downtown Peoria Heights. You see a couple buildings that are 2 stories tall. And then behind the brewery, it's all just a neighborhood. It just kind of shows you how the brewery just towered over this town. The original building obviously was 3 stories. It didn't look, but it's just amazing the small little piece of land that they had, that this massive brewery sprung from it and just towered over the city here. The picture in the lower left was a couple workers that up on top of the tallest tower, like the square step tower, they were up there tarring the top. The neat thing about this photo is the water tower in the background. When Premier Malt Products had it, they painted the water tower like a malt extract can. So in 1935, with the advent of the beer can, Pabst painted it like their export can. you can't see in the picture, but they actually put cool before serving under the word beer. So, you know, my hat's off to the person that actually added that detail that you couldn't see from the ground because of the way that the bottom of the water tower was. For the person that took that picture, that was a cool little touch. The bottom picture was 1934 from the washroom. I believe Pabst was the first brewery to use metal kegs. In the middle, the big machine is a keg washer. I cropped the picture out. On the right of the picture, you just see a little bit. They actually had 2 hand debungers. So when the kegs would come in, they debung it, run it through the washer, and send it off to be filled again. The picture on the right of the brew kettles, there's not many pictures. I've only seen 3 pictures, maybe, of interior shots of the brewery, which I think Pabst didn't want to give out their secrets. This was one that Pabst took, and if you're familiar with, there was a 3 postcard set that Pabst put out. They actually colorized that picture of the brew kettles for one of the postcards. Okay, next slide, please. So in December of 1938, the stockholders got together and decided, let's change the name back to Pabst Brewing Company. So they did. So the end of December 1938, the name was changed to Pabst Brewing Company. Business was huge. Pabst was doing great back where they picked up where they left off before Prohibition. And by 1941, the Peoria Heights Brewery had a capacity of a million barrels. And that's a cool little license plate topper in the lower right that I wish was mine. Next slide, please. So World War II, when World War II hit, obviously there was rationing, tires, all kinds of things. I don't know how well you can read this letter, but a former employee here, Scott Cranford, his grandfather also worked at the brewery. Pabst sent him this letter to his house in January of 1942 to help discuss, you know, the rationing. I'll try to read some of the highlights from it. Okay, the Pabst Brewing Company will, effective at once, discontinue making deliveries direct to consumers. This, of course, includes delivery to your house. So if you worked here, you had beer delivered to your house. And it says that you still, in the future, pick up your beer purchases at the branch. However, we would like to call your attention to the neighborhood Pabst dealer, where at a slightly higher price, you can make your purchases and at the same time do a great deal towards building up goodwill between your company and its customers. So it goes on to say about the already diminishing can stock. It has become necessary to discontinue the sale of canned beer at employees' prices. And it just goes on thanking them for their hardships. But so World War II, the neck label you see and then the top of the picture, it says, no more ribbon, no more metal foil, Uncle Sam needs them. Pabst had put those on the neck labels in September through December of 1942. And for the can guys out there, yes, Peoria Heights made an olive drab can and the silver withdrawn free can that you see for soldiers overseas. But before I go off from this slide, talking about, you know, the employees' beer sent to them at home, Pabst employees could buy, I believe it was a case of beer a week was their allotment that they could buy. They had Quonset huts set up just about a block from here, all the short pours, miscellaneous things they could buy over there. Another thing is, could they drink on the job? Yes. From the local brewery workers union handbook, section 15, free beer. Beer shall be furnished to the men employed free of charge during working hours. The amount and dispensing of it shall be subject to the regulation of the employer. So each break room had a keg tap. So when you went on your break room, you could sit there and you could pour yourself a beer. Talking with some of the former employees here, you know, some break rooms would have a hog trough in there where they might have canned beer in it if you wanted a canned beer. Obviously, having free beer on the job might cause problems, you ask. Talking with some of the former employees over the years, one of them, I don't know, it was which building it was in, but they had to use, coal shovels, probably loading hops or some type of raw material. Well, apparently these two had been drinking the majority of their shift and they got into a fight with the coal shovels. So the guy that initiated the fight got walked out, but the other guy was able to keep his job. One of the other stories I heard was some of the employees, when their shift ended, would find their way down in the basement of one of the bigger buildings and just sleep there at night because it was free beer here at the brewery. So they just lived here at the brewery, found a place to pass out in and wake up and do it again the next day. So yes, there was probably a few alcoholics created because of that clause. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Post-war, from when Prohibition ended in 1946, the brewing industry had numerous advancements, more power machinery, faster bottling lines, better refrigeration. So in the late 40s, Pabst was always notorious on keeping everything modern, up to date, clean. So even though the brewery here wasn't that old, they went through and modernized the brewery. The building that I'm in with the 33 room was built. There was a laboratory. The laboratory is still here in the building to do all the testing of the water. And they advertised it as a soundproof air-conditioned library, which that room is still here as well. So in 1949, when the renovation was complete, they had a week-long celebration they called Blue Ribbon Week. Okay, good. Next slide, please. Every day during that week was a celebration, all things Pabst. If the program events, picture on the slide, one day was Dedication Day, Science Day, Community Day, Illinois Day, Dealer and Distributor Day, Employees Day. The picture in the upper left, the gentleman on the left is Eddie Cantor, who was a radio personality Pabst sponsored in the late 40s, early 50s. He came in, he put on a couple shows at the Peoria Armory. That's what the blue ticket is. The Celebrate Blue Ribbon Week, everybody that showed up that week got one of those. The mugs in the lower left, those were handed out. Every day in the Peoria newspaper, there was ads congratulating Pabst on their new modern brew house. Cohen Furniture supplied the furniture, they had an ad. It's hard to see, but the one in the upper right that says congratulations on the top, that was from Gips Brewing Company. They had put a quarter-page ad in there congratulating Pabst on all the work. And sadly, Gips would be gone 5 years later. But it was just neat how Blue Ribbon Week came about. And one thing I want to touch on in the picture in the upper left, if you've seen the Pabst China, there was a set of china made for the Peoria Heights Brewery. As you can see, you might be able to see on the table, it's a sugar bowl, there's plates. Silverware was made with the Pabst logo embossed in it. The chair Eddie's sitting in is actually an engraved Pabst chair. Those were the original chairs and tables that were here in the 33 room. Okay, next. Oh, and then as part of the office building and the modernization of the brewery, a 500-seat auditorium was built in the brew house they called Blue Ribbon Hall. And a lot of the china was used in events they held out of Blue Ribbon Hall. And one neat thing about Blue Ribbon Hall is they'd hired an artist from Chicago to come down. He hand painted a mural on one of the walls of the auditorium on the history of brewing. Sadly, there are no good, clear photographs of that mural, and it was destroyed when that building was torn down. Okay, next slide, please. The 33 room, this is the room where I'm sitting behind the bar about where that guy is standing in like the gray colored shirt. This was the hospitality room that if you came here and took a tour, you ended the tour, they brought you into the 33 room for beer and pretzels. Numerous thousands and thousands and thousands of people from around the world have been entertained here. The picture in the lower left was a celebration that the Peoria Heights community did in 1976. And the reason, if you're not familiar with Pabst, they came up with the 33 room was in the late 40s. one of the slogans Pabst was using at the time was blended 33 times to make one great beer, or 33 to 1. So the 33 room name was just a perfect name for it. Okay, next slide, please. So more than just Pabst beer and ale was made here in Peoria Heights. As I touched on earlier, Casino beer was made in late 34. Old Tankard Ale was made in the late 30s. It was made again in the 50s here. Elk's beer was brewed for a company in Kansas. I think it was just brewed here, shipped in kegs. They bottled it themselves. 1956, Pabst took over the East Side Old Tap brand, and it was brewed here in Peoria Heights. As you know, Big Cap malt liquor, malt lager, stout malt liquor was all brewed here. Blatz, red, white, and blue. I've never seen an Ondecker can or bottle from here. I asked one of the employees, he wasn't sure if it was brewed here, but he's like, well, they had cans of Ondecker in the tubs of beer we could drink. So it really didn't answer my question. Pabst Light was made here. There was a memo found by a fellow collector that showed how much water to add to a batch of Pabst to make Pabst Light. So I don't know if made here, mixed here, blended here, but so Pabst Light was mixed here. Next slide, please. So the China set, the cabinet on the left is believed to be the complete set of China that was made here, minus a larger turkey platter, which obviously there wouldn't have been as many of those made. But there was a soup bowl, creamer, pitcher, sugar bowl, coffee cup, saucers, plates, baked potato bowl, salad plate. Those were all made for the Peoria Heights Brewery. And as you can see in the middle, a nice little Peoria piece they put out. I think it was also tied in with advertising for boxing. The sign you see in the lower right was made and hung in local bars around here primarily, saying, hey, when Illinois, stop and visit Illinois' most largest and finest brewery here in Peoria Heights. Surprisingly, that sign is very hard to find. I had one years ago. The cardboard was so bowed, the ribbon was gone. I got rid of it knowing I'm gonna get it. I didn't get another one until 2 years ago. It's just that sign does just not show up. It's probably about 2 feet by 2.5 feet in size. Right out of high school, I was delivering ice in one of the bars I went into. I walked in and here's this sign, but it's a larger version, probably 3 foot by 4 foot. The only one I've ever seen. Nobody's ever seen the larger one, and of course that bar is gone. But across the top, you see the 6 glasses with different Peoria records on them. This started in 78 up through 81. It's pretty neat that the Peoria Brewery was still cranking out like there was no tomorrow. Like in 1978, if you can't read that, Peoria shipments first half 1978, 1.6 million barrels. They had a 3.5 million barrel capacity here at that time. So for them to be making just over 3.2 million barrels in the late 70s, they were still cranking out the production here in Peoria. And the three or four glasses on the right was through 81, they were still setting records, racking, packaging, shift records. So the brewery was actually, was doing pretty good. So people thought. Next slide, please. So this was the headline in the paper, January 1st, 1982 in Peoria. Manager sees no hope for Pabst plant. If we go back a couple of weeks, the week before Christmas, all the employees here at the Pabst Brewery received a letter saying, thanks, we're closing down the brewery by the end of the year. Merry Christmas. Just, wow, thanks. So the union fought hard to keep it open as long as they could. They were able to keep it open until March of 82. And when these headlines come out, I was 14 years old at the time. I'd been collecting for whatever, 4 or 5 years by now. I remember my mom, I must have said something to my mom about, my frustration of the brewery closing. I'm 14. So she's like, well, if you want I will take you there and we can take a tour of it. I said no, you know, like, could you imagine a 14-year-old kid touring a brewery that's closing saying, I collect Pabst Peoria stuff? They would have probably gave me everything. I probably could have just for days loaded up car after carload of stuff, but someday I'll get over not touring here. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So March of 1982 was the last of the Peoria Heights Brewery. It was actually the 4th largest brewery in the US at the time, with a 3.5 million barrel capacity. Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, Pabst Milwaukee, and probably Miller in Milwaukee would be the 3 larger than the plant that was here. 700 people lost their jobs. They had a peak employment of over 1,000 people here. Some people, I have talked to a couple of them, they will, Pabst continued to make malt syrup down at the former Lysy plant. If there was jobs open there, there was a couple people that were able to get transferred there and fill them, but no, the majority of people lost their jobs. And Toby, you probably agree with me on this. The rest of the 80s, there probably wasn't a single Pabst sold here in Peoria County, just for what it did to the community here. But one just before we move on from this slide, you can see that downtown at the bottom of the picture, you can see how the brewery dwarfed downtown. But in this picture in the upper, there's that large warehouse. That was built in the 70s. Next slide, and I'll explain that a little better. Okay, so the city of Peoria Heights tried to find a tenant for the next couple years, but the early 80s, the brewing industry was just in the toilet, basically. Nobody's looking to expand or to add new breweries. So no luck was found for somebody to come in and take over this brewery to continue to brew beer here. But the one thing I want to touch about on this photo is in the upper left, you know, I made the comment, that large warehouse that was built. For all you guys that are into, you know, minor variations, Continental Can Company had a plant in Peoria. It's plant number 460. It was in Pioneer Park up in North Peoria. They made the solder seam cans there. They shut it down in the mid 70s and they moved here to the Pabst campus and they built that warehouse. So that was the Conoweld plant. All the cans Continental made for Pabst was made there in the warehouse. And if you look, there's an elevated conveyor that came into the back of the bottle house. So all the cans were sent across that conveyor into the bottle house, filled and out. Talking with one of the employees that worked at Continental Can, he did not know if they continued to use that 460 designation once they moved here. I mean, I would understand if they did. I don't know why they wouldn't, but. So that's a little history on Continental Can, and obviously they had a good thing going here with Pabst to build their warehouse on the property. So after no luck of trying to find a new tenant for the place, they decided, well, let's try to repurpose the property, take out some of the brewing equipment and see if we can't make it into something else. Next slide, please. Well, in March of '86, they were taking the tanks out of the stock house and a welder's torch caught the tanks on fire. This is the same building that caught on fire in 1934 and the top 3 floors had to be rebuilt. So it's kind of ironic that the beginning and end of the brewery was due to, you know, started and ended with fires to the stock house. So within a year, with the brewery being right in downtown Peoria Heights, you know, the city didn't want a big giant eyesore here. So within a year, almost all the buildings were torn down. The building behind the boom of the fire truck, that's the office building that I'm in. The 33 room is actually on the first floor to the left side. So luckily the fire did not do anything to this building here. So in March of '86 was the fire. March of '87, the majority of the brewery buildings were torn down. In March of '88, the Heart of Illinois chapter, we had a beer can show here in the 33 room. It was open for rent. I was 20 years old at the time. I had a 6-month-old daughter. I don't know how I come up with the money to rent the 33 room, but obviously the Heart of Illinois chapter, we were always looking for new places for shows. So to have a show here was great. I don't know where I come up with the money at to rent it, but I had it figured out. I sold all the tables just to get my money back. I just wanted to break even. I didn't want to make $1. I just, you know, let's have another can show here. Every table was sold. And like I mentioned earlier, when we had the show here, all the original furniture from 1949 was still in the room. The chairs, the tables, you know, perfect place for a show. Toby was here. So I'm setting up at the table, greeting everybody, telling them where they're going to be. Probably back then in '88, I was probably collecting cash at the door. So as I'm sitting here, you know, at the checking people in, well, they're checking in. The brew house was still left behind us. The administration building was mainly still empty because they hadn't rented out much of the office space. So people are coming in, setting up their stuff, and they're running through what's left of the brewery looking for stuff. So me, the Pabst Peoria Heights guy, I'm sitting there checking people in, and Brent Burnett, you know, he comes in, oh, wow, look what I found out here. Oh my God, look at this. You know, Dave Dozier, oh, guy, I found part of a chair. All this cool stuff, and they're finding, and I'm just waiting. Finally, when everybody's checked in, I'm like, oh, good, I can finally go. Hopefully you guys missed something. So I went running through what was left, and there was one thing left that they didn't. There was an old, I don't know how well you can see it. It says Pabst on the top and 1AQ. But what this is, it's an old film. Like an old movie would go in here, like a training film. Like in school, when they brought the card in with the big movie projector, the films were in a big metal box. So that, I mean, it's very neat and unique, but not what I could have found if I would have been the first one. But okay, so next slide, please. So that was March of '88 that we had a show here for the Heart of Illinois chapter. Again, before the meeting started, if anybody was here for that show and you have pictures, please reach out to me. We're trying to see if we can't find some kind of footage from that show. So about a year or two later, the reason I didn't steal one of the Pabst carved chairs that day was because I actually thought this would be an annual event, having a beer can show here. So I'm like, nope, I'm not going to steal anything. I want to be a good host. We'll come back. Well, within the next year, new ownership took over. They quit renting out the 33 rooms, so any future chance of a show was gone. They couldn't find anybody to come into this space to lease it out. So finally, a local jeweler, Brad Pettit, had interest of moving his jewelry store, so he actually come here and leased half of the 33 room. There's actually a wall put up here right now that cut it in half from what it used to be. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I started working with the owners of the Pabst campus here to have another beer can show here. We were going to have it out back where the brewery used to be. Everything, all the details were set up. We had a date. Flyers were made. I was just waiting on the last approval, and then we could start advertising. Then I was told the Pabst building was sold. The campus, we got new owners. Sorry, we sent all your information to the new owners. You know, good luck. I tried to get hold of the new owners. No luck. I finally had a one ad in the local paper for Pabst stuff. Well, they called me looking for stuff. So we got together, and that's when they were like, hey, the jeweler is going to be retiring in 2019. We're going to bring this back to hospitality room and, you know, get Pabst on draft here again. So when Brad retired in 2019, which helped pave the way to this 33 room to start selling beer again. One neat thing about Brad, the jeweler, his first job out of high school was making beer cans at the Continental Can Warehouse out back. So for him, it was kind of full circle to end up here. He actually had the first can that he made on display here at the back bar. So he retired, that's great, opened the way to bringing the 33 room back to life. The year before the building was sold, the other side of the 33 room was leased out by a daycare facility. So as soon as their lease is up, it's not going to be renewed. This wall is going to come down. It's going to go back to its original size, and back to, you can either rent it out if you want to have an event. So it's great that Pabst will be on tap here again. They're going to sell all the Pabst seltzers, the hard coffees, you know, and how they're embracing the history here of the Pabst campus. I was hoping it'd be completed by tonight, but there's going to be a large brewery and a case here, but that's okay. We'll have updates in the future. Okay, next slide, please. So what's up here today? The Continental Can Warehouse is the picture in the upper left. Sherman's, a local appliance center. They have a clearance warehouse in there. I mean, perfect use for the building. It's hard to see, but the little tiny picture, that was from their grand opening ribbon cutting ceremony. If you look real close, you'll see me. I snuck in the back. I had to be here that day because I'd never been in the warehouse before. So that was a neat day. And my refrigerator at my house was purchased there. So I do tell people I have a Pabst fridge. I do know the owner of Sherman's now. We went to grade school together. When he was getting interviewed for live TV on the grand opening day, you know, I asked him a question. I go, hey, have you found any neat stuff left over from the brewery? He's like, well, when we were redoing the loading docks here for the trucks, we found a bunch of flat top cans. You know, before I could really get excited, it's like that building was built in the mid-70s. Those weren't flat top cans, but okay, well. But it's neat that they're using that space and very successful. The picture in the upper right is the office building that I'm in. The lower pictures is what the 33 room looks like today. The logo in the middle is a new logo that they have created for the Rebirth of the 33 room. The lower right, those were photographs I have from my collection from the first week. The picture on the far right was from Blue Ribbon Week. And various pictures of the 33 room that they put in a beautiful wall wrap here. But the new owners, Robbie Matheson at the Grindstone Group, you know, I really appreciate him letting us do this here tonight from the 33 room. And like I said, Robbie and the KDB group, the new ownership group, they really embrace the history of this place. Once COVID hits, you know, we can have beer can shows, Breweriana shows here, you know, every year. We can have them right here out back. We can have them right out here on the side. You know, they own a barbecue joint and a Poor Brothers craft tap room across the street. They've given me more places where we could have shows when, you know, COVID lifts. But the one neat thing is he was able to have one official event at the 33 room before COVID hit. Next slide, please. The BCCA's own chapter, the Rice Brew Crew, held a chapter meeting here this past January. The majority of these members drove at least an hour and a half up from Springfield to join us here for the meeting. And I mean, it was a great turnout. They heard this Pabst presentation. It was a little more edited than this. I've actually added a lot to it since then, but it was great that a BCCA chapter helped kick off the Rebirth of the 33 room here in Peoria Heights. And since that picture has been taken, you know, the wall wraps weren't on the wall yet. They've done a lot of work in here since then. So hopefully we can make this an annual event with the Rice Brew Crew meetings here and other BCCA events. And that's all I have. Oh, I have one more thing. I don't see any Rice Brew Crew guys here, so this might be good. I have a trivia question to end the show. And the prize is a Rice craft beer can. What is the connection between Rice and Pabst?
Well, Kip, we have everybody muted, so we got a couple.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we got a couple more things we'll talk about, and then we'll open it up. We'll let people unmute. But yeah, there was a couple more things we wanted to go through, specifically just to talk about the cans a little bit. This was stuff I added. It was focused on the Peoria folks. And the Peoria Brewery primarily, but what I thought was kind of interesting, because this is when they were still primarily, the ale was only brewed and canned here at Peoria.
Right, and the ad that's shown on the right, that beer can was only made in Peoria.
Yeah, so that came out, and
advertising with that can.
Yeah, and everybody would have thought that ale was not a popular brand outside, other than maybe the Northeast, but granted, this ad was from the Boston Globe. I can't read the year. I think it's 1935. I also saw a lot of ads, surprisingly, out of Florida. Same ad. Tampa, Florida had an ad, and Miami, Florida had an ad as well. So then obviously the next one was where they took by Pabst off the bottom of the can, and then they went with the red opener. And Kip and I talked about there's no specific reason or known reason, but maybe someone else knows why they chose to use the red Pabst opener for the Peoria cans. So
Exactly, like he said, nobody really knows why red was used on that. And then there's a couple other cans, post OI cans that use red for Peoria. There's a couple other things we'll talk about in a slider here too. Go ahead, Keith.
okay. So then the dump that Kip was talking about, this was the article from the Rustlings that actually talked about it. So I wanted Kip to kind of talk a little bit about exactly what transpired at the dump.
So years ago, Nick Johnson and myself, when Nick still lived here in Illinois, we were, for whatever reason, it's like, well, let's go behind the brewery and see if we can't, there's that patch of woods back there. Let's go back there and see if we can't, find something they discarded. So we're back there and we start finding lids of cans. Whoa, okay, well, this is a good sign. So we start digging, and as you can tell, those cans were very close to the surface. It was like some kind of almost volcanic rock, slag, crap on top. So it didn't take much. You didn't need any tools to really dig into them. And then we realized it's all the same can and bottle. We estimate there's probably 6,000 to 8,000 cans and bottles in this pile, 3 to 4 feet deep at the thickest part, and maybe 15 feet wide going down a ravine. Every can, they were filled and packaged. Every can was in 12-pack boxes. And for some reason, they had instructed whoever dumped these cans, they had to poke a hole in every can. So this is one of the cans I found. You can't see it here, but there's a hexagon hole, one hole. So they had to sit here and punch something in every can, and then they just threw the boxes. Well, the bottles got thrown first. All the full bottles got thrown first. So whatever didn't break when they threw them, the cans on top would more than likely break them. Every can, as you can see in that picture, the tape residue from the boxes was still on some of the cans. And you can see in some of the pictures, I mean, there were still 12 cans next to each other, like they were still in the box. There was just that many of them pitched. And I have heard from another employee, because I asked him about this, if they did that often. He's like, well, I have heard stories that, they dumped beers back there and people would go back and get them. So that's why they tried to open them, pop them, something. And everyone had an Oklahoma tax stamp of these cans. I still found full bottles that didn't break, that still had a head on them. But Keith, I'm not sure, like, when I was out there taking the pictures for the Rustlings article, one of the pictures I showed, I'd found a piece of an old Pabst. I found an old light up 40s Pabst sign back there. It's like, don't know if it came from the brewery because there was some household dump stuff back there. But after I got back from Alaska dumping with Daniel, I went back there with my gold bug to see if I couldn't find any more pockets like this. Figured, okay, maybe metal detector can get down deeper. Maybe we can find some other dumps back there. Didn't find any more dumps, but I found another piece to that damn light up sign. So I got half of it now. But unfortunately, there's no Bach cans in that pile, no half quart cans in that pile. But yeah, if anybody wants to go back there, there's still thousands of them back there in that condition. Unfortunately, not worth anything.
And I think that's the last slide. Yeah, that's the last slide we've got there, Kip. So what I wanted,
I've got a few